Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. This time around, let's zoom in on Istanbul, the city where empires used to collide, and now where diplomacy goes to cosplay as relevance. Because yes, technically, peace talks might be happening somewhere, but only if you define talks as a meeting that's missing most of the people who actually matter. All right, so let's start with the basics. Putin is not there. Lavrov is not there. Instead, Russia has sent what it calls a delegation, but what looks more like a diplomatic group project where the seniors skipped town and left the interns to present the final report. On this episode, we ask the question, is that smoke or just Russian diplomacy? And without further ado, let's take a look at the latest report to find out more.
Many years ago, Istanbul, then still known as Constantinople, was seen as the world's most important city. Today it seems eager to regain that title, so far as peace talks on the war in Ukraine are concerned. While a full breakthrough involving an end to the war is not expected, it is the first time that Russian and Ukrainian delegations will officially meet since the failed talks in 2022. These two were held in Turkey.
If Putin is ready to meet, not only in the media, but in real life and then at the leadership level, we will do everything to agree on a ceasefire.
The official delegation list published by the Kremlin does not include Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russia also sees the talks in Istanbul as a continuation of the 2022 negotiations. Interestingly enough, one of the most important caveats of those talks was that Crimea was to be excluded. Russia doesn't give it back, Ukraine doesn't recognize it as Russian. The talks in Istanbul are seen as a chance to finally move the needle, unlike the result of the US-Russia talks, which don't seem to have amounted to much. After all, only Ukraine and Russia themselves can end the war.
We see that a new window of opportunity has opened with the recent contacts. We hope this opportunity will not be wasted.
Until at least a ceasefire is reached, something that the Ukrainian side and its European allies are hoping for, the fighting will not stop. No matter what beautiful messages are shared by either side, Ukrainian soldiers will remain vigilant.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. The talks concerning a possible end to the war in Ukraine continue to dominate Western discourse. Yet no peace between Russia and Ukraine can be achieved unless their leaders sit down at the same table and simply talk to one another.
Any meeting between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelenskyy today is only the second in their capacities as presidents. The previous official talks between these two leaders took place at the end of 2019, a lifetime ago as far as politics are concerned. Back then, the two met in Paris as part of the Normandy Format Summit. The meeting was meant to help find a solution to the so-called Donbass War, which Russia started several years prior. There was some hope for an end to that conflict, as the summit resulted in a fairly large prisoner exchange and promises of supporting ceasefire efforts with all necessary measures. Another point included a roadmap for elections in the occupied Luhansk and Donetsk regions, with plans to reintegrate the territory of the rest of Ukraine. Kiev and Moscow also seemed eager to return to and uphold the Minsk agreements from 2014 and 2015. Unfortunately, this summit did not lead to any long-term solutions. A repeat involving the representatives of Germany, France, Russia and Ukraine took place in January 2022, though without the president's presence. As history shows, that one was far too little, far too late.
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. The Russian delegation is led by presidential advisor Vladimir Medinsky and includes two deputy ministers of foreign affairs and defense, as well as Igor Kostyukov, director of the main intelligence directorate of the GRU. So basically, the guys who normally fetch coffee for the guys who fetch coffee for Sergei Lavrov. This is not a peace delegation. It's the foreign ministry's B team. And even that is generous, actually. Now, normally, when two countries at war sit down to talk peace, you would expect the people who actually started the war to be involved. But this is more like failing to show up for a job interview and instead sending your cousin with a resume you made in Microsoft Paint. And on the other side of the table, there might not even be a table, because as of recording this in the early afternoon of Thursday, Ukraine has not officially announced any delegation at all. So it's not peace talks yet, not in the normal meaning of the word. Meanwhile, President Zelensky has arrived in Istanbul and wasted no time cutting through the diplomatic theater. Upon disembarking from his plane, he referred to the Russian delegation as stand-in props, which is brutal. Accurate, but brutal. But calling them props implies someone, somewhere, is still directing this circus. For now, Ukraine is holding off on deciding its next steps. Zelensky's plan is to meet with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan before anything gets locked in. Which, to be fair, makes sense. If you're about to sit down at a table with 4 mannequins in business suits, it's worth checking with the host to make sure it's not a hidden camera show. But seriously, this whole charade shows us exactly where Russia's mindset is right now. They're not negotiating peace. They are staging a photo op, a performance, a bluff. And Zelensky? He's not playing along. He knows that unless the real power players show up, or unless Erdoğan personally introduces some kind of breakthrough, this is all theater. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Vera Constantinova, former foreign policy advisor to the chairman of the Ukrainian parliament. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good day, thank you for inviting.
So, Putin skipping his own party, essentially, was that move calculated to offend the Ukrainian delegation?
I believe that it's important to mention that from Ukrainian side, there was no misperception of the true intentions of President Putin to end this war. Because since the beginning of full-scale invasion, the main goal of the Russian Federation was obvious for everyone in Ukraine as well as in our partner countries from neighbors. The main goal is to destroy Ukraine as a nation, as an independent state, to destroy Ukrainian statehoods. That's why it's important to understand that Putin's goals didn't change, and such a failure of negotiations right now in Istanbul and the absence of the main figure, because Putin is the only person who can make a decision regarding stopping this war. So he is absent, as you correctly mentioned.
So now, would you say that this is also a major diplomatic win for President Zelensky? Because he immediately responded, okay, I will be there waiting for Putin. And this is also a signal to the US administration so they can see once again who is willing to participate in the peace talks and who is only pretending to be.
First of all, it's a huge diplomatic failure of the Russian side, because the Russian side was manipulated for the talks regarding the readiness to conduct any negotiations in terms of final solution. Currently, there is an idea to achieve at least 30-day ceasefire. And this idea is also had failed due to inability of the Russian side to follow the advice, I would say so, such diplomatically, an advice of President Trump to stop this war against Ukraine. So indeed, the diplomatic, again, our main goal, I mean, from Ukrainian perspective, is to stop this war and to establish some kind of peace on our land, in our sky, and at the same time, due to the some kind of public concerns, I would say, in terms of further diplomatic efforts, despite the efforts of President Erdoğan, despite the efforts of Crown Prince bin Salman from Saudi Arabia, we are still on the same page in terms of having strikes, in terms of having missile strikes, drone strikes on Ukraine. Recently in the morning, we also had an experience, I would say, with 110 drones, try to achieve our critical infrastructure and cause damage to our people. So in terms of diplomatic solution, of course, we need to speed up our efforts, to unite our efforts with our European partners. And declaration and statement that I had heard from our partners in Europe, I would say that there is an understanding that this round of negotiations in Istanbul would cause further sanctions. And I think that we need to speed up our efforts and to unite the idea with the administration, with the Trump administration, that there is no other solution except pressure on Russia to stop this war.
So indeed, sanctions should be the sword of Damocles hanging above the Kremlin, especially if it doesn't follow its very own promises. But coming back to the Russian delegation, do you think there is a risk they will be trying to sneak in the so-called Istanbul communique and try to present it as a bona fide peace deal? And many commentators have already said that this communique, coming from 2022, would have been an absolute catastrophe for Ukraine. For several reasons.
Indeed, I've heard statements made by some Russian delegators, and their reference to so-called Istanbul agreements of 2022, it's the main starting point for negotiations and for their negotiation position. So there is nothing had been changed according to their understanding since February 2022, even March 2022, when Istanbul round was held. But again, since 2022, since several campaigns that Ukrainian armed forces conducted in order to liberate occupied territories of Ukraine, there is a significant shift right now in terms of more than 3 years of aggression, of war of aggression. Russians hadn't achieved any goals declared at the very beginning of this war. So, despite their statements, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy had already declared that there are red lines, and Ukrainian society and Ukrainian delegation wouldn't cross these red lines in any case. So that's why it's important to have a support of our European and American partners, because even some kind of so-called territorial concessions in order to achieve some kind of lasting peace, it's also inappropriate way of conducting the negotiations. It's unacceptable idea for all countries that are still based their foreign policy or internal policy on the international law. So in my opinion, despite attempts of Russian side to push their agenda, even President Erdoğan for several times stated that Turkey respects the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It means also with the Crimea, Ukrainian Crimea. So I believe that the Russian side would try to push this direction, but in terms of result, I believe they would fail in this dimension as well.
And of course, all of that we're talking about has to be appended with this sort of annotation that at the time of recording of this program, we don't know certain things. Some things might actually happen since then, but still, in a very general sense, you've mentioned Erdoğan. Why would you say Turkey would not be interested in Russia's expansion in the region? Because, of course, he has mentioned principles of international law, but Turkey also has an interest in maintaining at least a balance between Ukraine and Russia.
First of all, we should realize that Turkey is a country of Black Sea region, and Turkey and Russian Federation or Russian Empire in the history, they had some tensions. And of course, for Turkey as a country member of NATO, it's important to have stability in the Black Sea region without drone strikes, without different problems with free sea. So in terms of my understanding, for President Erdoğan, he's a very well-known mediator. And of course, since February 2022, President Erdoğan even earlier, when the idea of political prisoners were among the issues to be discussed, President Erdogan played a significant role in terms of our Crimean Tatars to be back to Ukraine. And of course, after the beginning of the war, President Erdogan played a significant role in returning our people from Azov battalion. So I believe that in terms of Turkey foreign policy, mediation efforts conducted and continue to be conducted by President Erdogan would be an added value for Turkey as a regional power. Of course, in terms of mediation efforts, Turkey should have some kind of approach to Ukraine as well to Russia in order to have some kind of communication channels with both sides. That's why I can explain the significant dimension and dynamic of economic policy and economic relations, both with Ukraine as well with Russia. But at the same time, President Erdogan continue to play a role of mediator, and I believe he is rather successful in this regards.
Speaking of mediators, what do you think about the role of the United States? Are they going to step down? Are they going to understand that it is Russia that is the problem in this entire process and not Ukraine? Do you think there is still a possibility that the US will go back to a more traditional approach, namely supporting Ukraine if diplomacy fails? Because Russia, again, is not doing anything to make diplomacy succeed at this stage.
I believe that our strategic partnership that had been established with the American side is still active. And despite some political statements and declarations, despite specific approach to negotiations, I believe that we are still partners in needs and partner indeed. So in terms of my prognosis, I would say that currently we are on the constructive stage of our relations with the American partners. But at the same time, we are so grateful for all assistance, military aid provided by the American people to Ukraine. But at the same time, I would like to remind that Ukraine is actually the shield of Europe right now. And in terms of, for example, frontline nations like Poland, like Baltic states, like Finland, without Ukrainian experience in conducting and combating Russian aggression, so such countries would be at risk in terms of if Russia decided to test Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. So I believe that we are solution of the European security dilemma for Americans, and we can be a partner in terms of constructing the security architecture in long-term domain. But at the same time, yes, we need to have weapons, we need to have trainings, we need to have financial resources, and we need to do our homework as well. I believe, based on these estimations, our relations with the American side would be beneficial for both.
And the same goes probably for NATO membership of Ukraine, although right now the US is firmly against that. Hopefully we will have a chance to discuss this issue in the future as well. Perhaps Western European countries might be making a mistake in abandoning the concept of having Ukraine as a powerful ally there as well. But for the time being, Vera Constantinova was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. As ceasefire talks between Russia and Ukraine might finally be leading to something more concrete, some Ukrainians are looking to the future. For example, while they would eagerly take part in elections, a majority of Ukrainians don't want them to be held before a full peace deal has been reached.
A stunning 71% of Ukrainians do not support the idea of holding important elections without a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine being enacted. This means that even in the case of a long-term ceasefire of security guarantees, they would be against a vote, according to a poll published by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. Only 25% of Ukrainians say that elections should be held soon after a ceasefire, a modest increase since March. The subject of presidential elections in Ukraine gained some traction a few months back. President Volodymyr Zelensky's term as president was originally scheduled to end in May last year. Due to the ongoing Russian invasion and martial law being imposed upon the country, the presidential election could not be held according to its original timeline.
German authorities say they have rejected most asylum requests submitted by Russian men of draft age. Thousands of such applications have been submitted to Germany since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
According to data from the German Interior Ministry published by Berliner Morning Post, less than 350 Russian men aged between 18 to 45 out of some 6,400 were granted state protection. This concerns applications that were put forward between early 2022 and April 2025. This number includes everything from refugee status, asylum, or simply protection from deportation. The remaining men were either outright denied or their cases were closed after they were given asylum in a different European country. Some German lawmakers from the opposition left party say that this number is, quote, shamefully low. On the other hand, a Berlin court ruled last year that young Russian conscripts were more likely to be assigned to border guard units rather than face deployment to Ukraine, which weakens their asylum claims.
Ukraine's energy sector is facing a very serious problem. Gas analysts are warning that Ukraine's gas storage reserves have fallen to their lowest level in at least 11 years.
The reserves of natural gas in the country's underground storage facilities reportedly dipped to slightly over 6 billion cubic meters in May 2025. This means that there is less gas available in storage than in previous years, according to estimates. There are several reasons for this decrease, but the main one is the ongoing Russian invasion and the fact that Russian forces consistently target Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This in turn leads to both power and heat shortages across the country, as well as difficulties with storing natural gas. Despite these problems, Ukrainian authorities are reportedly hard at work to gradually restore the country's natural gas production. This sector was particularly heavily hit by the Russians in February and March of this year.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.